This section on nature, knowledge, and technology, the video component of it will be a lot shorter compared to some other sections. So I've got 4 different artists to look at, and one way to perhaps break them down into a couple main themes is that the first 2 I'm going to show you are really approaching technology from a very positive standpoint, thinking about technologies perhaps over a really long period of time. Part of your reading included the Nazca lines, which are in Peru, very ancient earthworks. They're believed to have been used as pilgrimage trails or perhaps to mark celestial events. And so James Turrell, the first person I'm going to show you, is picking up on those themes. He's obviously aware of things like the Serpent Mound or the Nazca lines, which are in your book. And the second person I'll show you is Ch13. He is from the Netherlands and has a really unique and kind of scientific approach to making art. So one of the things that I can point out just right here, this image at the beginning, is that James Turrell comes from the tradition of minimalism. If you think of those different artistic movements that you saw back in the deriving meaning section, one of them was minimalism. So in the 1970s, artists had kind of gotten to the point where they really had broken down art to its really most basic constituencies. James Turrell, I think, kind of took it to the logical extreme and stopped working with any kind of object at all and simply made works of art using light. And so you see some in this video, but Roden Crater, perhaps his greatest accomplishment, is sort of the ultimate work with light. So he actually bought this land, which has an extinct volcanic crater on it, and he's, over a couple of decades, built some features into that crater which help track rare celestial events. But part of the experience too is when you see people laying on their backs inside this dome is really just a way to experience the sky and the rotation of the earth as though it were a moving work of art. By isolating the sky without the horizon, you're able to kind of observe the skies in a way that you wouldn't otherwise. He's incorporated this into several projects, architecture, particularly for spiritual gatherings, shaker spaces where there's a hole in the ceiling that allows people to kind of contemplate this moving work of art. One of the things I find really powerful and moving about what he's doing at Roden Crater is offering you opportunities to see light from various sources. Light from the sun takes just a few minutes to travel to the earth, so it's relatively new light, but he is creating experiences here in Roden Crater where he's concentrating light from stars that are millions of light years away. So that light is really, really old. In fact, the stars that emitted that light might not actually exist in this moment. They may have died a long time ago, but the light from those stars has taken millions of years to travel to us. The next person we're looking at is Ch13, and I really love his artwork. When I first started showing it in my classes, I actually had a hard time talking about it because it is so unlike other art, really not meant for a gallery or museum. He's, I think, raising a lot of really fundamental questions like how do creatures evolve? He uses scientific names for his works and speaks in terms as, like these things are evolving, they're surviving. He's figuring out how to make creatures that can live in a harsh environment. And when you think about it, beaches really are harsh environments. I mean, they're wet, they're windy. We like them for sunbathing, but they can easily get really hot and really dangerous. So, he's making organisms that can survive in these conditions. So, he's Here's a really good example of an artist who is inspired by scientific knowledge and I'm sure an enormous amount of research about things like animal locomotion. So he's really approaching technology from a very positive standpoint, that we can think about how we can make machines that can live and perhaps gather energy. One of the things I really like about his art is that he's also given himself very severe limitations. These tubes are the conduit that's used for electric wiring in Europe, and zip ties and water bottles. So he's purposely giving himself very strict limitations in terms of the materials that he can use to develop these creatures. He could use a lot more sophisticated materials, but he wants to try to work within these limitations. The next artist is pronounced Ch13. We have some interesting European pronunciations this week. He is a Swiss artist, although in the video he speaks French rather than Swiss German, and his work is a good illustration of the idea that technology can be really wonderful. It can do a lot of really miraculous things in our time, but very often technologies come at a cost. One really good way to illustrate this is that people the age of the average college student, 18 to 22 years old, the leading cause of death among that age group is automobile accidents. So technologies can be really helpful, but oftentimes come at a price. Think of the pollution involved in creating things like computers. We all love our devices, but it comes at an environmental cost. This work I find particularly moving because it is made from the remains of a Formula One race car. Formula One is a very popular form of racing in Europe, just like NASCAR is in the United States. And this work is particularly chilling because it is made from the remains of a car in which the driver was killed. A very popular Formula One driver. Ch13 got access to the remains of the car and created the sculpture. So it's really a good illustration of this idea that we can do these really miraculous things, build a vehicle that can travel 200 miles an hour, but it can also kill the driver. And while there are elements to a lot of his work that are kind of sinister, you notice that he uses a lot of animal skulls, a lot of found objects, this metal that's rusted or twisted. So they have elements that are somewhat sinister, but he can also be very playful. In the Homage to New York, the first video I showed you, if you notice there's a lot of smoke and fire involved, he actually didn't mean for that to happen. Apparently, when he set that machine in motion, there was some friction that was hot enough to actually set part of the sculpture on fire, and he just looked at that as a kind of unintended but welcome conclusion to that work of art. Many of his works have musical instruments. They can be brightly colored, they can be very childlike, so he's can have a sense of humor but also a serious side. And the last artist I'm going to talk about in this section is Survival Research Laboratory. Now, here's another collaborative group, sort of like the Guerrilla Girls, but definitely a bunch of boys getting together and making robotic works of art. And similar to Ch13 in terms of, I think, the message here. Definitely not a positive portrayal of technology. It's got kind of a sci-fi Mad Max sort of quality to it. And I think one of the messages that they are putting out with this work is that, again, technology isn't always wonderful, particularly when you think of military technology. These are kind of crude combat-like vehicles. They actually have performances where they fight and destroy each other. So they're really calling into question the priorities that we place in our culture on technology and in particular technology that is meant to kill. They're kind of unique in that they create these very elaborate performances, perhaps only once a year, because in the meantime they have to build new devices. So they're using really sophisticated technology, remote control, robotics, probably a lot of computer programming involved in these things, but with a much more kind of sinister message.